In the hush of twilight, when the winds from the desert softened and the Nile began to shimmer beneath the moon, one could almost hear the echoes of ancient voices, whispers carried across the centuries. The air, warm and fragrant with the scent of lotus and wet clay, wrapped around the land like a silken veil. And here, in the cradle of one of humanity's oldest civilizations, life unfolded in rhythms both sacred and sensual. To understand what intimacy truly meant in ancient Egypt, we must first unfasten our modern assumptions and let our minds be led gently through the temples and homes of a people who saw no boundary between the divine and the bodily. To them, the act of love was not a hidden indulgence. It was sacred, elemental, necessary, a bridge between earth and sky, between mortal and God. Under the watchful eyes of deities like Hathor and Isis, love and pleasure were celebrated rather than shunned. In the temples dedicated to these goddesses, rituals involving music, dance, scent, and even symbolic union were common, designed to honor fertility and cosmic balance. Sexuality was woven into mythology itself. The gods loved, desired, grieved, and longed, just as humans did. And so, to be human was not to be flawed, but to mirror the divine. Still, beyond the glow of the sacred flame, everyday lives played, out with quiet tenderness. In modest homes of mud brick and woven reeds, husbands and wives shared more than survival. They shared laughter, arguments, reconciliations. In the flickering light of oil lamps, they whispered promises and memories, love poems, scratched in hurried handwriting on scraps of pottery and papyrus, spoke of longing in words as raw and vivid as anything written today. Some praised the curve of a lover's neck, the scent of their hair, the ache of waiting just one more day. Others begged for hearts to be returned, for affection to be rekindled. These were not anonymous verses. They were fingerprints left by real people who once walked beneath those same stars we still see. And in their words, we hear a truth. Intimacy, in all its forms, mattered. It was not merely tolerated, it was essential. Women in ancient Egypt lived with a kind of autonomy rare for their time. They could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in religious and legal life. This independence extended into the realm of personal relationships. In many surviving texts, female desire is not only acknowledged, but centered. Spells for attracting love often focus on the emotional and sensual connection, reflecting a culture that did not see love as one-sided or purely physical. Erotic art, too, was not hidden away in shame. Though relatively rare, examples like the Turin erotic papyrus portray scenes of human sexuality with humor and detail, suggesting that eroticism was accepted as part of life's tapestry. Far from being crude, these images were vivid, expressive, and oddly joyful, perhaps kept as private amusements or simply as an affirmation of life's pleasures. The tools of love were both symbolic and practical. Tiny alabaster jars held scented oils used to anoint and awaken the body. Jewelry often carried hidden messages, amulets shaped like fertility symbols, pendants engraved with invocations of desire. A lover might wear the image of a lotus, or a frog, or the ankh, the symbol of life itself, as a gesture of intimacy. These were not trinkets, they were tokens layered with meaning. Even in death, the hope for reunion lingered. Tombs were adorned not only with prayers for the afterlife, but with depictions of couples touching, gazing into each other's eyes, seated side by side for eternity. One inscription reads, "My heart follows you in the west, as it did in life." This too speaks volumes. That love, physical, emotional, spiritual, was seen as enduring beyond the grave. So what was sex really like in ancient Egypt? We cannot claim to know the full truth. The walls do not speak. The papyri are incomplete. But if we listen closely, there is a murmur beneath the silence. It tells us that love was not hidden, that passion was neither feared nor punished, that the act of union was sometimes sacred, sometimes playful, sometimes complicated, just as it is today. In the following chapters, we will dive deeper. We will walk through the temples of Hathor and explore the rites that honored both fertility and joy. We will examine the hidden language of amulets, the choreography of ritual dances, the stories of queens and servants who shaped their own destinies in matters of the heart. We will uncover the songs and spells that bound lovers together and those that broke bonds apart. But for now, let us linger in the quiet of this first moment, where the river hums, the night deepens, and somewhere in the darkness, a flame is lit in the name of longing. The temples of ancient Egypt were not merely places of solemn worship. They were sanctuaries of life's full spectrum. Birth and death, joy and sorrow, order and chaos. And within them, hidden behind massive stone walls, lay rituals and beliefs, where sexuality was not peripheral, but central to the cosmos itself. Among the most revered was Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and fertility. Her temples, especially the grand complex at Dendera, stood as beacons of sensual worship. Unlike other deities who demanded fear or austerity, Hathor invited joy. Her festivals were filled with music, dancing, perfumed oils, and offerings of wine and sweet bread. But underneath the celebration lay deeper layers, acts meant to honor not just fertility in the agricultural sense, but fertility of the body, of love, of spirit. In the heart of the temple, sacred rituals unfolded that mirrored the union of God and goddess. These were not voyeuristic spectacles, but ceremonial acts where priestesses might represent the goddess herself, embodying her power through movement, through gesture, even through symbolic union. Men and women alike participated, understanding that in reenacting divine love, they were helping to maintain Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. It is said that during certain rites, women would sing songs filled with poetic innuendo, weaving sensuality into sacred verse. The music, the rhythm, the fragrance of incense, it all worked in harmony to create a space where emotion and body were aligned. In these moments, sex was not hidden or whispered about. It was exalted. It was the very rhythm of life. The temple. Dancers, often young women trained in sacred arts, moved with deliberate grace. Their dances told stories, not just of romantic longing, but of the cycles of creation, of night giving way to dawn, of seed and soil and the bloom that follows. Every motion was symbolic, every step part of a choreography older than memory. Watching them, one did not merely observe beauty. One felt time folding inward, collapsing into a single pulse of connection between human and divine. Beyond the temples, ordinary Egyptians also practiced rituals that invoked sexual energy, often in private moments or during transitions such as marriage. Amulets played a key role here. The image of the god Min, often depicted with an erect phallus, symbolized potency and protection. These amulets weren't crass. They were carried with reverence, kept close to the body or placed in the home, signifying hope for fertility, passion, and enduring love. Spells found in surviving papyri reveal how deeply magic and love intertwined. A lover might write a verse asking the gods to turn the eyes and heart of their beloved toward them. Another might mix herbs and wine, whispering intentions as they stirred, believing that every ingredient carried spiritual weight. These were not potions to control, but prayers to connect. They expressed yearning, not domination. In marriages, sex was viewed as both duty and delight. The legal documents outlining marriage agreements often included references to conjugal affection. This was not just about heirs, it was about companionship, pleasure, mutual respect. A good husband was expected to satisfy his wife, and vice versa. This expectation was not merely physical, it was emotional too. Harmony in the bedroom was seen as essential to harmony in the household. The celebration of fertility extended to public festivals as well. During the annual Feast of the Beautiful Reunion, for example, the statue of Hathor was carried from Dendera to meet her consort Horus in Edfu. Though the reunion was symbolic, it was also explicitly sensual. Songs were sung, wine flowed, and the people rejoiced in the union of the gods. Their joy was not separate from their own lives, it was a mirror. As the gods loved, so did they. As the gods created, so would they. Even the architectural symbolism of temples echoed these themes. The sacred sanctuary, hidden at the heart of the temple, was sometimes referred to as the womb of the goddess. The processional path leading into it mimicked the journey of life itself, an entry from light into sacred darkness, from noise into silence, from multiplicity into union, and then the return. It was a rebirth, but not all stories were joyous. There are fragments that suggest pain, jealousy, unfulfilled longing. Love spells sometimes speak of desperation, of hearts turned cold, of lovers gone astray. The ache of absence was known just as well as the sweetness of union. In these sorrows too, the Egyptians found divinity. Just as Osiris was torn apart and later reunited with Isis, so might the heart endure rupture and still be mended. In every layer of Egyptian spirituality and daily life, from temple rites to household shrines, from sacred hymns to whispered poems, we see that sexuality was not something to be cast out of sight. It was seen, honored, and integrated. It was a language through which the people spoke not only to each other, but to the divine. So when we ask what sex was really like in ancient Egypt, we must ask a different question as well. What did it mean? And the answer, whispered softly through stone corridors and across the reeds of the Nile, is this. It meant connection. Between lovers. Between gods. Between the body and the spirit. Between what was known and what was dreamed. Far from the grandeur of temples and the formalities of ritual, life in the villages and cities of ancient Egypt moved to the beat of the ordinary. And yet, it is in these quiet corners, in homes made of clay and straw, beneath ceilings woven from palm fronds, that the most tender stories of love and intimacy took root. Imagine a modest house along the edge of the Nile, where the mud walls breathe with warmth during the day and hold the cool of night. A young couple sits close, perhaps on a reed mat, their dinner of lentils and bread eaten slowly under the light of a flickering oil lamp. Outside, the river moves quietly. Inside, hearts speak in soft tones. For most Egyptians, love and marriage were not affairs of grandeur but of practicality, companionship, and often genuine affection. Couples married young, and while some unions were arranged, particularly among families of means, many were chosen by mutual desire. The Egyptians had no formal wedding ceremony in the way we think of one. Marriage was often marked by the simple act of a man bringing a woman into his household. From that moment, they were seen as husband and wife, their bond recognized by the community. But this simplicity did not strip their unions of meaning. In fact, it allowed space for intimacy to flourish without pretense. The walls of these homes held laughter and sorrow, conflict and reconciliation. Children ran through courtyards while their parents shared stolen moments. Eyes meeting across the room, a hand brushing an arm, a whispered promise before sleep. Documents from the time, including marriage contracts and legal agreements, reveal a nuanced view of partnership. Women had rights. They could initiate divorce, keep property that had been theirs before marriage, and even retain custody of children in some cases. This balance of power made love not just an emotional exchange, but a relationship of respect. We see hints of this in letters preserved by the dry Egyptian sands. One, written by a man to his wife, reads like a plea wrapped in affection. He apologizes for a quarrel, begs for forgiveness, and promises better days. Another letter, found in a workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, speaks of longing, the ache of separation, while the husband worked far from home. He ends his message with a line that still feels alive. "Your voice is the north wind that cools my heart." These were not nobles. They were artisans, laborers, bakers, and fishermen. Yet their words reach us across time with clarity and emotion. We know their names. We know their hands were rough from work, their backs bent from toil. But we also know their hearts were open. They loved with a familiarity we recognize instantly. Love poems, too, give us a glimpse of intimacy lived and felt. One such poem, likely recited in private or exchanged as a token of affection, says, "I wish I were her Nubian maid, who wakens her from sleep, who combs her hair, who washes her body and brings her wine." There is a sensuality here, but also reverence, a longing not just for the body, but for nearness, for presence. The speaker does not desire conquest, but closeness. These poems were often sung softly, passed along like lullabies or confessions. They reveal a culture unafraid of tenderness, but intimacy was not always smooth. The same texts that celebrate love also speak of betrayal, jealousy, and heartbreak. Some spells found in the magical papyri were intended to mend broken relationships, to bring back a straying lover, or to dull the pain of unrequited affection. These incantations, some written with poetic flair, others in hurried script, remind us that love, even then, could wound as well as heal. Consider a fragment where a woman calls upon Isis to bind his heart to mine, so he forgets all others. The desperation in such a line speaks volumes. It is a voice familiar to anyone who has ever feared being forgotten. Yet even in sadness, there was ritual. There were ways to grieve, to seek comfort, to turn inward and speak to the gods. The Egyptian worldview did not separate emotion from spirituality. A broken heart was not just a personal pain. It was something the cosmos could witness and perhaps help restore. Sexuality within marriage was also seen as a vital part of life. While no manuals exist in the way modern readers might expect, indirect evidence, like medical papyri, love charms, and fertility figurines, suggests that couples valued sexual harmony. Women used perfumes and cosmetics not just for public appearance, but for private allure. Men, too, used unguents, combed their hair with care, adorned themselves with amulets believed to heighten desirability, and there was laughter. Ancient Egyptian society had a rich sense of humor, and this extended to matters of love. Jokes, graffiti, and playful sketches found on pottery shards suggest that love was not always solemn. It could be cheeky, teasing, joyful. One piece of graffiti found near Deir el-Medina shows a man with exaggerated features offering a flower to a woman, her expression somewhere between amused and intrigued. It's a reminder that flirtation, awkward, hopeful, sweet, existed then just as it does now. As we explore these lives, we're not looking through the lens of a distant, exotic culture. We're peering into a mirror. The tools may be different, the songs may be ancient, but the feelings, those are eternal. It begins with ink on limestone. In a small workers' village nestled on the edge of the desert, not far from the Valley of the Kings, a scribe named But-Hamun picks up his reed brush. He is not recording pharaohs or prayers today. He is writing to his wife. The winds outside rustle through the dry hills. Dust creeps along the doorway. But inside, beneath the dim glow of a lamp, a man writes of longing. The village of Deir el-Medina, home to artists and craftsmen who built and decorated the tombs of royalty, was unlike any other in Egypt. Its residents were literate, skilled, and tightly knit. The walls of their homes were covered not in hieroglyphs of conquest, but in graffiti, doodles of animals, sketches of lovers, bits of poetry. This was a community alive with expression. And in the heart of this world, But-Hamun's letters stand out. He writes to his wife, Ikhtai, during a period of separation. Perhaps he has been sent to another site for work. Perhaps illness or ritual, obligations keep them apart. Whatever the reason, his words are filled with tenderness and urgency. "You are my house," he writes, "my roof, my cool water in the heat." It is not flowery language. It is domestic, familiar, and precisely because of that, deeply touching. In calling her his roof, he is saying what all lovers know in their quiet moments, that the beloved is not merely an object of desire, but a place of safety, a home for the soul. He goes on to ask about her health, about the children, about the garden. There is a paragraph devoted to a dream he had in which she walked beside him along the banks of the Nile. He describes her dress, fluttering in the breeze, her laughter echoing like wind chimes. "I woke with your name on my lips," he tells her, "and my heart was both full and aching." These letters were not hidden treasures. They were kept, read aloud, responded to. Iktai too wrote back, though fewer of her letters have survived. But in one, her voice comes through clearly. She scolds him gently for forgetting to send a jar of fig jam. She reminds him to wear his neck amulet when he travels. And she signs the letter with a simple line. "May Hathor watch over you as I do every hour." Their love was not extraordinary in the eyes of their neighbors. It was familiar, even typical. But through their words, we see a world not shaped by myths alone, but by daily affection, by partnership lived moment to moment. Butahamun's profession as a scribe gave him the tools of expression. He could shape emotions into symbols, render longing in neat rows of script. But his feelings were not elevated because of his skill. They were elevated because they were shared. His longing, his joy, his domestic worries, they were common. That is their magic. When we think of the ancient world, we often think in terms of spectacle, towering monuments, golden sarcophagi, epic battles. But here, between the lines of a letter written by a man to his wife, we find something much rarer, a whisper of the ordinary, a man missing his partner, a woman checking on her husband's health, love, quiet and unadorned. It's possible that Butehamun and Iktai exchanged small gifts alongside these letters. Fragments of cloth with a spritz of perfume, a small amulet wrapped in linen, a drawing of a bird they once saw on a walk. These were tokens not meant for ceremony, but for remembrance. Archaeologists have also found heart-shaped beads, carved from carnelian or faience, buried with letters or placed near shrines. Some were inscribed with wishes for protection, others with verses of devotion. These objects speak to the desire not only to love, but to preserve love, to carry it through distance, even through death. There is a tomb painting, likely inspired, by couples like Buthamen and Iktai, showing a man and woman seated side by side, arms gently touching. They gaze forward, not at each other, but together into the future. Between them sits a small table with bread and flowers. The symbolism is quiet but profound. Nourishment, beauty, and shared time. And yet, not all letters were answered. Some, found among the ruins, are one-sided, pleas that never received replies. A husband begging for forgiveness. A wife expressing concern over silence. A lover confessing a mistake. These too are part of the landscape. Love in ancient Egypt was not perfect or predictable. It was as full of uncertainty as it is today. But what is extraordinary is the way they wrote through it. Even in heartbreak, the letters are careful, respectful. A man who fears he has been replaced still addresses his beloved as "my star." A woman who doubts her husband's loyalty still wishes him health and long life. There is no scorched earth in these lines. There is only hope, and perhaps this is the lasting message from the sand-covered streets of Deir el-Medina, that love, when spoken, when written, becomes real. It holds weight. It travels across distance, across time. As we close this chapter, the ink on Butahamun's letter has long dried. The papyrus is brittle, the edges frayed. But the feeling, that soft, persistent ache of missing someone, still hums through the script. It is the same feeling that lives in texts sent late at night, in letters never mailed, in whispered names on pillows. Night in ancient Egypt was not just a time for sleep. It was a time for revelation. As the world outside the mud-brick homes fell silent and the stars wheeled over the dark Nile, Egyptians closed their eyes not merely to rest, but to journey. Dreams, they believed, were not figments of imagination. They were messages, visitations, glimpses into the sacred and unseen. And love, longing, pleasure, heartbreak, often arrived most vividly in these midnight visions. Across centuries, fragments of dream books have survived. These were not stories, but guides, collections of symbols and their meanings, carefully compiled by priests or scribes who studied the currents of the divine. In one such book, written in the New Kingdom, a man who dreams of kissing a woman is told that his desire shall be returned. If he dreams of walking beside her in the moonlight, it is a sign of loyalty. If she disappears in fog, beware. Her heart may be slipping away. These interpretations were not merely poetic, they were taken seriously. Families consulted dream interpreters much as they might consult healers. Love was not left to chance. It was tracked, read in the stars, examined in sleep. Sexual dreams, too, were treated with gravity. A dream of making love in a garden might suggest fertility, literal or metaphorical. A dream of being embraced by a stranger could foretell a surprise suitor. But not all omens were welcome. Some warned of betrayal, of passion misplaced, of desires that might lead to social ruin. It was not the act that carried judgment, but the context. Dreams that broke natural order, seduction in a temple, union during mourning, were taken as signs of imbalance in the dreamer's world. The stars also held sway in the affairs of love. While astrology as we know it would develop more fully, in later cultures, the Egyptians were already keen observers of the sky. They believed the gods spoke through constellations, through eclipses, through the precise moment of one's birth. A child born beneath the rising of Sirius, the star of Isis, was said to be especially sensitive in matters of the heart. Those born under the protection of Hathor's star were thought to be magnetic, irresistible to others. Lovers sometimes timed their confessions according to celestial rhythms. There are records of festivals held on nights when Venus was brightest, or when the moon hung lowest and fullest over the desert. A sign of openness, of receptivity, of romantic success. It wasn't magic, it was alignment. To the Egyptians, the heart's timing was part of a grander symphony. Superstition wove itself through daily gestures. A woman might wear a particular color, deep blue for fidelity, green for renewal, when she wished to attract her partner's affection. A man might slip a small scarab amulet under his pillow, inscribed with a prayer for union, before approaching a lover. Perfumes, too, held layered meanings. An oil made of frankincense and lotus was not merely pleasant. It called forth clarity, peace, emotional connection. Even animals played roles as omens. To dream of a cat licking your hand was a good sign. Intimacy would come gently. To see a falcon carry off a dove meant the heart was in danger, perhaps from jealousy, perhaps from a rival. These weren't fixed rules, but stories passed down through families, whispered from mother to daughter, scribe to apprentice, over many generations. But what of those who feared love? Who carried wounds deeper than the river's bend? For them, dreams could be protection as well. Some carried small figurines of Bez, the dwarf god who guarded against nightmares and emotional turmoil. Others placed bowls of natron water by the bedside, believing that the liquid would absorb bad thoughts, and that by morning, the fear would be washed away with the sunrise. Notably, many dream rituals were communal. Lovers consulted each other's dreams, interpreting signs together. A woman might say, "I saw you on a boat drifting toward the east. Does it mean your thoughts are far from me?" A man might respond, "But in my dream, I swam back to shore." In this way, dreams became conversations, private, sacred dialogues woven into the fabric of affection. The role of dreams in passion was not limited to the young or unwed. Married couples spoke of shared visions. One account from an older pair tells of recurring dreams where they relived the day they met. Her drawing water at the well, him dropping his basket in awe. They saw this repetition not as a ghost, but as a blessing. "The gods have etched our love into time," the husband wrote. There were temples dedicated entirely to dreams. At places like Serabit el-Qadim and Deir el-Bahari, petitioners would sleep within the sacred chamber in hopes of receiving guidance through dreams. These visits were called incubations. A person might seek insight into a partner's feelings, clarity after a fight, or courage to speak love aloud. They would lie on stone benches with heads on papyrus pillows, fasting beforehand, sometimes anointed with oils to open the spirit. In the morning, if the gods were generous, they would awaken with a vision or a feeling. Sometimes, no dream would come, but even that was seen as a message. Not all love reveals itself at once. Of course, cynics existed even then. Some dismissed dreams as illusions. Others mocked the practice of interpreting signs. But even these skeptics often kept a personal talisman or refused to sleep under a full moon when hearts were unsettled. Doubt was rarely total. In the deep hours of the night, even the hardest minds softened. Perhaps that's the most telling truth. In a world filled with uncertainty, plague, famine, war, love dreams were constellations of comfort. They reminded people that desire was alive, that affection had shape, that somewhere beyond the veil of sleep, a beloved might reach for their hand. In ancient Egypt, the pulse of life was measured not in hours or days, but in the rise and fall of the Nile. Each year the river would swell with the summer rains from distant lands, flooding the plains and leaving behind a rich black silt. This cycle, destruction followed by renewal, was not only the basis of agriculture, but the very rhythm of existence. And at its heart lay a mystery that the Egyptians understood intimately, that creation and pleasure were one and the same. Fertility of the land was mirrored in the fertility of the body. A field ploughed was a womb opened. A seed planted was a lover's gift. When the Nile rose, it was said to be the tears of Isis, mourning Osiris. But it was also Osiris himself, returning, in liquid form to awaken the land, to make it fruitful again. These were not metaphors alone. They were beliefs, deeply held, lived with reverence. The myth of Isis and Osiris shaped much of Egyptian thought on reproduction and sensuality. When Osiris was slain and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, it was Isis who gathered his pieces, reassembled his body, and breathed life back into him. In some versions of the tale, she fashions a golden phallus, since that was the one part of him never recovered, and conceives their son, Horus, through a final act of love. This story, repeated in temples and tombs for centuries, did more than explain divine lineage. It enshrined the idea that desire could conquer death, that even in grief, the body could call forth life, that love, when sacred, could heal what was broken. In practical terms, Egyptians paid close attention to fertility. Women tracked their cycles using rudimentary methods, monitoring bodily signs, consulting priestesses, offering prayers at household altars. One papyrus even suggests an early form of pregnancy testing, involving the watering of seeds with a woman's urine to determine whether she carried life. Sexual intercourse was not limited to pleasure or reproduction. It was also agricultural, symbolic, even political. During the annual festival of the Nile's inundation, rituals were performed that linked human union to the rising waters. People celebrated with music and dance. Offerings were floated down the river, and in some periods, symbolic acts of sexual union were carried out to ensure the fertility of the soil. In one telling, a high priestess might play the role of the goddess, inviting the spirit of the river or sky to unite with her in symbolic form. These rites were shrouded in privacy, cloaked in sacred songs and sweet-smelling smoke. They were not spectacles for public consumption, but acts of profound spiritual continuity. Farmers, too, had their own ways of honoring this connection. Before planting the first seeds of the season, couples would sometimes spend a night in the fields, believing that their physical union among the furrows would bless the crops. The earth, like a lover, responded to touch, to warmth, to presence. Throughout the countryside, shrines to Min, god of fertility and harvest, stood tall. Often depicted with an exaggerated phallus, Min was not a god of vulgarity, but of vitality. His presence in the fields was a reminder that growth required passion, not just water and sunlight. Offerings to Min might include bread, lettuce, a vegetable associated with arousal, and incense. Women seeking children would visit his temples with quiet prayers, touching the statues in hope, leaving tokens in gratitude. The link between food and desire was deeply embedded. Lettuce was considered an aphrodisiac, not only for its stimulating properties, but because it grew upright and produced milky sap. Figs, with their soft insides and sweet flavor, were sacred to Hathor and often given as courting gifts. Honey, another symbol of both nourishment and pleasure, was used in love potions and offered to newlyweds. Midwives and healers passed down knowledge through generations. What to eat to boost fertility, what herbs could ignite or calm desire, what rituals to perform when the womb seemed slow to stir. They understood that the body was part of the land, that what bloomed in the soil must also bloom in the skin. It wasn't only women who carried these concerns. Men, too, sought to ensure their virility, their ability to plant, not just seeds in the ground, but lineage in the world. Some used salves and ointments made from dates, garlic and oils to heighten performance. Others wore amulets to maintain balance between heart and loins, believing that too much desire could cloud judgment, while too little could drain life force. Even clothing played a role. During certain festivals, men and women would wear transparent linen robes adorned with symbols of fertility, lotus blossoms, frogs, stalks of wheat. It was not for seduction alone, but celebration, a public joy in the generative forces of life. To be alive was to be sensual, to be intertwined with the cycles of growth, decay, rebirth. In art, these connections found form. A wall painting might show a couple beneath a fruiting tree, surrounded by birds, with the Nile in the background. Such images were not erotic in the modern sense, but rich with meaning. They told stories of partnership, pleasure, plenty. A full belly and a full heart were not separate states. They were part of the same blessing. And when famine struck or the floods failed, it was not uncommon for people to turn inward, examining the health of their relationships, their prayers, their intentions. Had they honored the gods of union? Had they made love with gratitude, not just hunger? These questions were not abstract, they were real. For to the Egyptians, love and food, sex and survival were parts of the same divine tapestry. To understand love in ancient Egypt, one must first listen to the women, not only the queens whose names have echoed through temples, but also the wives of fishermen, the daughters of scribes, the priestesses who walked barefoot through incense-laden halls. Their voices are not always loud. Some reach us in faded ink, others in statues worn smooth by centuries of touch. But they are there, waiting. In many ancient societies, women's roles were restricted to silence or subservience. Not so in Egypt. Though still bound by a patriarchal structure, Egyptian women enjoyed remarkable rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, inherit wealth, and represent themselves in court. These legal freedoms extended into the realm of love. A woman's consent mattered. Her feelings were not dismissed, they were documented. We find traces of this in love poetry written in a woman's voice, rare in antiquity, yet common in Egypt. One such poem, possibly sung or recited in the home, begins not with flattery or hesitation, but with boldness. My heart flutters hastily when I remember your love. It lets me not act sensibly. I can no longer keep my feet. I can no longer hold my dress in place. This is not a demure muse waiting passively to be adored. This is a woman overcome with desire, with longing. She is not ashamed. She is alive. Other poems paint pictures of lovers sneaking glances at the marketplace, meeting by moonlight, brushing hands as they pass water jugs. But the woman's gaze is always present. Her thoughts, her emotions, her body, these are central, not incidental. Within the home, a woman's power continued. She was the keeper of lineage, the nurturer of children, the architect of domestic harmony. Sexuality within marriage was often tender and reciprocal. Husbands were encouraged, both socially and spiritually, to be attentive to their wives, not only as mothers of their children, but as partners in affection. Love was not just tolerated within marriage, it was hoped for. Some surviving marital contracts include clauses about good treatment, fidelity, and mutual support. A husband who mistreated or neglected his wife could be brought to court. A wife who was unhappy could, in some cases, leave with her dowry intact. This legal framework gave women leverage not just in disputes, but in love itself. But beyond the ideal household, there were women who wielded influence through devotion, mystery, and magic. The priestesses of Hathor, Isis, and other goddesses were not simply ornamental figures. They were guardians of sacred knowledge, performers of ritual, interpreters of signs. Many were selected from elite families, educated in temple schools, trained in music, chant, healing arts, and ceremonial dance. Some took vows of celibacy, dedicating their passion to the divine. Others, especially in Hathoric cults, performed rituals meant to invoke fertility and erotic power. Record from the Dendera temple describes a procession where priestesses danced with sistrums, rattles associated with arousal and joy. Their steps were slow, deliberate, sensuous. The dance was not performance, it was prayer. The audience, if any, was divine. Yet not all powerful women wore linen veils or temple garlands. Some ruled. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, ascended to the throne and ruled for over 2 decades. Though she often depicted herself in male form for political reasons, she did not erase her identity as a woman. Her mortuary temple, Deir el-Bahari, is filled with inscriptions that balance authority with grace, power with poetry. What did love mean for a woman like Hatshepsut? Records of her personal life are limited, perhaps intentionally erased by successors, but we know she bore a daughter. We know she ruled with strategic brilliance, and we know her legacy endures not because of conquest, but because of what she built. Temples, trade routes, harmony. Other queens, such as Nefertari, wife of Ramesses II, left behind grand tributes to marital affection. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is a masterpiece of art and emotion. In it, she is shown not just as consort, but as intellectual equal, as spiritual guide, as beloved. Ramesses wrote of her, the one for whom the sun shines. Yet even women without palaces or monuments left impressions. Midwives, for instance, held immense respect. They knew the ways of the body, the patterns of the moon, the herbs that eased pain or heightened pleasure. In their hands lay the mysteries of birth and renewal. They were often the ones young girls turned to when questions of desire, of fear, of curiosity arose. One text even mentions women advising their daughters on love spells, carefully choosing the wording, the ingredients, the timing. These were not manipulations, but appeals, a wish for attention, a hope for connection. Not all stories are joyful. There are fragments of heartbreak, women abandoned or betrayed, women who lost children and carved grief into stone, women whose names appear only once in a curse or a plea, but who once loved deeply. Their sorrow too is part of the record, for to love truly is to risk, but risk did not deter them. Even within a framework where men often had multiple wives or concubines, many women found ways to assert individuality, to write, to sing, to demand love, not just duty. Their statues do not always survive. Their names are not always known, but their words, those soft, strong, clear voices, remain. To see the full shape of love in ancient Egypt, we must now step into the minds of its men, not just kings and generals, but farmers, scribes, and builders. These were men who bore the heat of the midday sun on their backs, who knelt in fields or hunched over scrolls by candlelight, and who, despite the hardness of their labor, carried in their chests a softness rarely spoken aloud. For many of them, love was not a proclamation. It was a gesture, a bowl of water left near a wife's feet at night, a hand brushing crumbs from a shoulder. a flower tucked into the fold of a linen robe. But in the written word, their hearts revealed more. Ancient Egyptian men, especially those literate or close to the temple class, often expressed desire in letters and poems. Unlike the boastful tone found in later Greek or Roman texts, Egyptian male voices in love are strikingly tender. They are not conquerors of women. They are students of affection. One scribe writes, "Her voice opens my skin like the morning sun. I cannot write when she is near. My hand forgets the alphabet." It is a confession not of power, but of surrender. He does not control his longing. He lives in it. Others express longing with a quiet ache. In one clay tablet fragment, a man writes, "I passed your house and heard you laughing. I smiled all day and did not tell anyone why." In another found, buried with a man in his modest tomb, the inscription reads, "If I do not see your face, I forget how to breathe." Masculinity in ancient Egypt was not separated from emotion. To be a man was to feel deeply, though often privately. Love was considered a sign of maturity, not weakness. A man who loved well was seen as one who understood order, ma'at, the harmony that governed life and the cosmos. Just as a well-tended field yielded crops, a well-tended heart yielded peace. Marriage was the most common outlet for male affection. While men of status sometimes took multiple wives or concubines, especially to ensure heirs, many marriages were monogamous and rooted in companionship. Tombs often depict couples touching gently, holding hands, seated side by side. This physical closeness was not just artistic, it was reflective of lived truth. Legal documents reveal that men were held accountable for how they treated their wives. One preserved papyrus outlines an agreement. The husband pledges to provide his wife with clothing, food, and sexual satisfaction. Failure to do so could result in her leaving him, her property rights intact. This legal recognition of mutual responsibility shaped how love was practiced. But beyond obligation, there was joy. Husbands wrote to their wives with warmth. One fragment, translated from a limestone shard, reads simply, "Come home soon. The house is full, but without you, it is hollow." In love spells, men often invoke the gods to grant favor in the eyes of a beloved. These spells sometimes ask that the woman think of the man constantly, dream of him, feel warmth in her limbs when he approaches. While the language could seem possessive, it was not about domination. It was about yearning, about being seen. In rare cases, same-sex attraction is hinted at, though these fragments are scarce and often ambiguous. A handful of tomb paintings depict men in unusually intimate poses, and some texts describe friendships with emotional language that may point toward deeper affection. One controversial tomb, belonging to Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep, two male officials, depicts the pair in poses usually reserved for married couples. Their story, lost to time, remains open to interpretation, but their closeness was enough to endure in stone. Jealousy, too, had its place. In both love spells and dreams, men feared being replaced, forgotten. One papyrus preserves a man's plea to the goddess Hathor. "Let her eyes turn from him. Let her voice speak only my name." This, again, is not conquest. It is fear dressed as prayer. In literature, male characters are not immune to heartbreak. The tale of the doomed prince includes a moment where the prince loses his beloved due to a cruel twist of fate. His sorrow is not mocked, it is honored. The gods, in some versions, restore his love to him as a reward for his faithfulness. The moral is clear. Constancy is divine. Men also carried love into death. In many tombs, husbands left inscriptions for their wives, asking to be buried beside them, or describing dreams of reunion in the afterlife. A stele from a desert tomb reads, "May I walk beside you in the field of reeds, hand in hand, as we did in life." Sometimes love outlasted logic. A man might leave offerings at the tomb of a former lover. He might write letters to the dead, asking for guidance, or simply telling them they are missed. One such letter, scrawled on a potsherd and found in a worker's grave, says, "I still dream of your laugh. It chases away the sand." This devotion was not rare. It was rooted in the belief that love did not end with the body, that it was a form of energy, preserved through memory, ritual, and word. To love was to defy death, even if only for a while. In the broader scope of Egyptian thought, male and female energies were not seen as oppositional, but complementary. Every man carried some measure of Hathor within him: joy, vulnerability, song. Every woman carried the courage of Horus, the will to act, to protect. And in love, these energies found balance. So when we ask how men in ancient Egypt loved, the answer is simple. They loved quietly, steadfastly, sometimes foolishly, often beautifully. They wrote, they waited, they wept. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy not of power, but of presence. Even in a culture as open to sensuality as ancient Egypt, there existed boundaries, social, religious, moral, beyond which love became risk and desire turned to danger. These boundaries did not always lie where we might expect. The Egyptians, after all, embraced physical love in art, myth, and daily ritual. But some passions still had to be hidden, some names never spoken aloud. The concept of forbidden love in ancient Egypt was less about morality in the abstract, and more about the disruption of ma'at, the sacred order of balance and harmony, that underpinned all things. When desire threatened that balance, through betrayal, through blood ties, through power, it became taboo. One of the clearest examples of such danger was incest within the royal family. Pharaohs, in order to maintain divine bloodlines, often married their sisters or half-sisters. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was not seen as perverse by Egyptians. Rather, it was modeled after the gods themselves, Osiris and Isis, siblings and spouses, whose union symbolized life reborn. In these cases, what was taboo for the commoner became sacred for the king. But outside the palace, such unions were strictly condemned. Legal documents and ostraca show that relationships between close blood relatives, especially parent and child or full siblings, were seen as violations of natural law. These were not just socially frowned upon, they could provoke divine punishment. A dream of sleeping with one's sister, for example, was sometimes interpreted as a warning from the gods. Affairs between married individuals and outsiders were another kind of forbidden. Though men often held more social freedom in relationships, adultery was not taken lightly, particularly for women. A wife caught with another man could be divorced, disinherited, even punished physically depending on the husband's status and temperament. The stigma was not merely personal, it was communal. The household, seen as a microcosm of the universe, had been disrupted. That said, punishment was not always severe. In many cases, separation and loss of property were deemed sufficient. The law aimed to restore order, not exact vengeance. And it is worth noting that some love letters and court records suggest that infidelity, while disapproved of, was not rare. People fell in love with those they shouldn't, just as they do today. There were also liaisons across class lines, servants and mistresses, scribes and queens, dancers and nobles. These relationships were complicated by power, secrecy, and imbalance. In some tombs, we find mentions of unnamed companions or household friends, possibly euphemisms for lovers who were not permitted official recognition. Among the most whispered about were the temple encounters. Priestesses of certain cults, especially those dedicated to Hathor and Amun, were believed to embody divine sexual energy. In rare and tightly controlled ceremonies, they may have participated in symbolic acts of union, either as solitary ritual or in conjunction with a male counterpart playing the role of the god. These rituals were not open to public view. They were held in darkness, in silence, and bound by oaths. But beyond these sanctified acts, rumors always circulated. Stories of priestesses who fell in love with temple guards, or of high priests, who used their position to seduce initiates. appear in late-period folklore. Whether these tales reflect reality or serve as moral fables is unclear. What is certain is that where passion meets secrecy, stories follow. Same-sex love, too, occupied a space between silence and suggestion. While there was no official condemnation, akin to later religious systems, and while some texts contain affectionate language between men, explicit references to male-male or female-female sexuality are scarce. This absence may reflect taboo, or simply the limits of surviving material. But art occasionally hints otherwise. In the shared tomb of Nyankuknum and Khnumhotep, two men who held the title of overseer of manicurists to the king, the imagery is intimate. They are shown embracing, touching noses, a gesture equivalent to kissing. Their wives appear, but in secondary scenes. Whether they were lovers, close relatives, or simply dear friends remains debated. Yet the possibility of same-sex union, even unspoken, lingers in the stone. Outside elite circles, forbidden love could take on more mundane, yet no less dangerous forms. There are tales of a servant and a merchant's daughter whose late-night meetings were betrayed by a jealous neighbor. Of a young man who fell for his employer's wife, caught only because he carved her name into a tree. In one such story, preserved in a single damaged fragment, a girl writes to a boy, "If you do not come tonight, I will think you are like all the others, only promises and breath." Some were discovered, some fled, some disappeared. These lovers left no grand tombs, no epic poems, only whispers, but not all forbidden love ended in sorrow. In the ruins of a house in Amarna, archaeologists found two skeletons, buried together, side by side. One was of higher status, the other a servant. Their hands were touching. No inscriptions, no names, but someone had laid them together, gently, with purpose. Perhaps in life they had hidden, but in death they were joined. The Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, one could be reunited with the beloved, regardless of status, gender, or circumstance. The field of reeds, their version of paradise, was a place where lovers walked without fear, where fields were always fertile, where the heart no longer needed to hide, and so, while society placed walls around certain desires, the soul yearned across them. Love, even forbidden, found ways to persist, in glances, in dreams, in notes burned after reading, in prayers whispered into bowls of water. In the land of ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a passage, a continuation of life on another plane. And just as they built their homes with care and filled them with symbols of affection, the Egyptians prepared their tombs with the same devotion, believing that the bonds of love, if properly honored, would endure into eternity. Among the many beliefs that structured Egyptian afterlife practices, one stands out with quiet beauty: that love does not die with the body. It lives in the ka, the vital essence of the soul. It travels with the ba, the spirit that soars like a bird across thresholds, and it finds eternal companionship in the field of reeds, a mirror world of earth, where lovers are reunited beneath the ever-golden sun. The tomb was a place of reunion as much as remembrance. Couples who had lived long lives together were often buried side by side, their images carved into limestone walls in postures of affection. A husband's arm around his wife's shoulder, a wife offering lotus flowers, the symbol of rebirth to her partner. These were not gestures frozen in stone. They were promises. In the tomb of Nebamun, a scribe and grain counter, he is depicted with his wife Hatshepsut. They stand together at a banquet, sharing food and music, surrounded by flowers. She touches his arm and he looks toward her, not as a functionary or subordinate, but as a beloved. The message is clear. This love was not only for life, but for the beyond. Funerary inscriptions often included direct addresses from the deceased to their spouse. One man wrote, "May your heart follow mine into the west, so we may rest together, beneath the sycamore tree." Another, inscribed in a woman's tomb, simply reads, "Wait for me." These phrases were not symbolic. They were earnest, emotional hopes that love would bridge the divide between this world and the next. The physical items buried with the dead reflected these sentiments. Amulets shaped like hearts, or carved with the names of lovers, were laid beside the body. Perfume jars, letters, lockets of hair, all tokens of shared life and feeling, were tucked into sarcophagi. Some tombs even contained statues of a couple embracing, carved so that their souls could always find each other again. In more elaborate tombs, scenes of domestic intimacy were painted with soft, naturalistic gestures. A couple fishing together, in the afterlife. A wife braiding her husband's hair. A husband presenting wine to his partner under flowering trees. These depictions were not just decorative. They were visions of eternity, hopes painted into permanence. But mourning was also part of love. When one partner died before the other, grief became sacred duty. The surviving spouse would perform rituals of lamentation, often accompanied by professional mourners. Yet in many households, the most profound rituals were private. A bowl of water placed beside the bed, a favorite piece of clothing left untouched, a quiet offering made each week at the family shrine. Some wrote letters to the dead, asking for protection, expressing sorrow, or even making apologies. These letters were sometimes buried with the deceased, sometimes left at the tomb, sometimes hidden in the home. One surviving text, addressed to a deceased wife, reads, "You left before. Our garden bloomed. I still water it, hoping you smell the flowers." The dead were not gone. They were simply silent. And in that silence, love still spoke. Priests played a key role in ensuring the continuity of this bond. In annual festivals like the Feast of the Valley, families visited the tombs of their ancestors, bringing food, drink, and music. These events were not somber. They were reunions. Songs were sung, stories retold. The living and the dead dined together in memory and in spirit. Statues and stelae often bore inscriptions to the good husband or the loving wife. These were more than titles. They were testimonies. In a society so focused on order and eternity, to be remembered as loving was perhaps the highest honor. In some tombs, we even find stories carved in intimate detail. One man wrote of how he met his wife beneath the market awning, how her laugh startled a bird into flight. He described the color of her robe, the softness of her voice, the exact curve of her smile. To etch such things in stone was to declare, this was real, this was worth remembering, this will not be lost. It wasn't only romantic love that endured. Bonds between parents and children, between siblings, between deep friends, were preserved in similar ways. Tombs often included entire family groups, standing together in the eternal image of unity. The afterlife was not a solitary place. It was a place of reunions, and sometimes love in death revealed what was hidden in life. There are tombs where the names of lovers appear for the first time, unlinked to marriage, rank, or duty. A single line carved near a sarcophagus reads, "For him, I waited each night." Another, at the base of a statue, says, "She was my joy." These subtle marks suggest that, when life ended, the truth of feeling was finally allowed to surface, even in the simplest graves, where no murals or inscriptions survive. Archaeologists have found evidence of care, a body wrapped with unusual tenderness, two hands laid together, a shared necklace tied around skeletal fingers. These gestures speak of something deeply human, the refusal to let go entirely. Because in Egypt, to be forgotten was the real death, and to be remembered with love, by name, by story, by heart, was immortality. As we close this chapter, we begin to see the fuller tapestry of desire in ancient Egypt, not only passion and pleasure, but devotion and memory. A kind of love that, like the river, ebbs and flows, but always returns. In ancient Egypt, when words failed, when gestures fell short, and when longing became unbearable, there remained one final path: magic. The Egyptians were a deeply spiritual people, and their understanding of the world was not confined to what the eyes could see. They believed in invisible forces, in energies that flowed between people, gods, and nature. Love, being one of the most powerful of all energies, was thought to be shaped, summoned, even softened through ritual. Love spells, known as Heka workings, were not seen as dark or manipulative. They were as natural to the Egyptian worldview as prayer. To ask for love was not considered selfish. It was a request for harmony, for connection, for wholeness. A person might turn to a priest, a wise woman, or even an experienced neighbor to find guidance in the art of enchantment. Many such spells survive today, written on papyri tucked into tombs or discovered in the ruins of homes. Their language is poetic, their images vivid. One spell, meant to stir desire, calls upon Hathor, goddess of love. Turn her heart to me like the lotus turns to the sun. Let her thoughts be wrapped in my voice, her breath echo mine in sleep. These incantations often included symbolic acts, burning herbs, drawing images in sand, whispering names into bowls of water, or placing tokens beneath the lover's threshold. They were not meant to overpower, but to open pathways, like knocking softly on a closed door. In some rituals, names were written on clay figurines or inscribed on pieces of linen that were then wrapped around small amulets. These were carried, close to the body, pressed against the skin, as if the warmth of longing could infuse the charm with strength. Others involved food or drink, spiced wine, honey cakes, fruits soaked in oils, prepared with intention and shared as offerings of affection. Perhaps the most beautiful element of these spells was their emotional honesty. A woman might write, "If he sees me not, I wither. If his hands hold another, let mine tremble until he returns." A man might confess, "I cannot work, I cannot eat." Her name is the bird that sings in every silence. But not all spells were gentle. There were darker edges too, prayers for vengeance when love was betrayed, for forgetfulness when the pain became too sharp. One bitter spell, likely written by a woman wronged, asks Isis to freeze the seed of the liar, that no woman may find joy in his arms. Another, cast by a man whose affections were ignored, begs the gods to bind her feet in dreams, so she walks only to me. These harsher spells reveal the same truth as the tender ones. Love, when denied, becomes desperation. And in desperation, the heart may ask for impossible things. Still, the Egyptian magical worldview was governed by balance. Spells that harmed or manipulated were believed to carry consequences. Misusing Heka could draw the attention of angry spirits, or worse, offend the gods. For this reason, many love spells included protective invocations, asking the gods to bless the act, to ensure it came from truth, not obsession. Temple priests maintained scrolls of proven formulas, some of which were passed down for generations. Others were homegrown. Whispers shared between sisters, inscribed quickly in the corners of markets, or painted onto walls in red ochre. Among the most fascinating were dream spells. To summon the affection of a distant lover, a person might sleep, with a specific amulet beneath their head, or speak the desired name aloud before drifting into slumber. If the dream brought the lover near, it was considered a sign the spell had begun to work. Perfumes also held magical weight. Some spells called for the use of myrrh, lotus, cinnamon, and even blue lotus oil to soften the heart and awaken the senses. These oils were worn on the wrists, behind the ears, on the chest, so that every breath became a call, every touch an invocation. Clothing, too, could be enchanted. A scarf worn by the beloved might be secretly touched with a mixture of honey and wine, while a short verse was whispered, "As this cloth warms your skin, so may my heart warm yours." The item was then returned without the wearer ever knowing. Love. Spells also blurred the line between personal desire and religious devotion. In temples, votive offerings, small statues, inscribed stones, tiny stelae, were placed at the feet of divine statues. These objects often bore inscriptions like, "Bring her smile to me," or "Let him speak my name before the sun sets." The offering was both a prayer and a pact. Children, too, were part of this tradition. Mothers sometimes whispered protective charms over babies, asking that their future lovers be kind, faithful, gentle. Love was not just a moment, it was a destiny to be shaped and safeguarded. There are even records of entire families participating in love rituals, a mother advising her daughter, a brother helping his sister prepare a sweet cake for the one she admired. Magic was not fringe, it was part of life, woven into the daily fabric of emotion. Skeptics existed, of course. Not everyone believed spells had power, but even the doubters often kept a token hidden in a pouch, just in case. Because deep down, everyone wanted to be chosen, to be seen. And when spells didn't work, people often returned not with anger, but with sadness. A man whose efforts had gone unanswered wrote, "The gods heard me not, or perhaps they heard too well and knew my heart was not clean." In this, we see a kind of spiritual accountability, an understanding that desire must be met with clarity, not control. As we close this chapter, we leave behind a world not only of incantations and offerings, but of hope. Hope that the heart's cry might be heard across distances. Hope that the gods who shaped the stars also cared for lonely voices on earth. Before the ink of papyrus dried, before the chisel-marked stone, there were stories. Around fires, in courtyards, beside the river, Egyptians told tales, not only of gods and pharaohs, but of lovers, tricksters, dreamers. These stories were more than entertainment. They were mirrors. Through them, people explored the beauty and peril of the heart, the risks of longing, the price of betrayal, the triumph of devotion, and like all great love stories, they often began with a glance or a mistake. One of the oldest known Egyptian tales with a romantic thread is the tale of the two brothers. It begins as a story of family loyalty, Anpu and Bata, two siblings living a peaceful life, until desire enters the scene. Anpu's wife falsely accuses his younger brother Bata of seduction, echoing a theme that would resurface across cultures for centuries. The accusation leads to exile, heartbreak, transformation. Bata flees, and through divine favor, becomes part of a fantastic cycle. He loses his heart, his life, his love, and regains them through trial and magic. Eventually, he becomes king. The story is layered, part myth, part morality, but beneath it all lies a deep meditation on trust, temptation, and the fragility of affection. What stands out is not the grandeur of the setting, but the emotional realism. Betrayal is met with pain. Loss is mourned. Love, even in a magical tale, is not immune to danger. Another beloved story, The Doomed Prince, tells of a boy cursed at birth. He will die by crocodile, snake, or dog. To protect him, his father builds an isolated palace, but isolation cannot protect the heart. The prince grows curious, restless, and eventually ventures into the world, where, of course, he meets a princess. Their love blooms in secret, tested by riddles, escapes, and the ever-present shadow of the curse. In some versions, love triumphs, and the curse is broken. In others, tragedy wins. The versions vary, but the message is clear. Love is never free of risk. To love is to step beyond safety. These tales often feature women as active agents, choosing, resisting, outwitting fate. The princess in The Doomed Prince does not passively wait. She speaks, acts, intervenes. In The Tale of Truth and Falsehood, a woman chooses truth over riches, despite personal loss. In The Shipwrecked Sailor, the hero recounts an encounter with a serpent god who offers wealth, but the sailor confesses he longs only for his family. Desire in these stories is not simply about possession. It is about recognition, being seen, understood, valued. The tales ask, who would risk everything to return to you? Who would stand beside you when all else falls away? And sometimes the answer is tragic. There's a lesser-known tale found in a fragment of the Westcar Papyrus involving a magician, his wife, and a secret lover. When the affair is discovered, the magician does not rage. He crafts a wax crocodile and uses it to exact poetic justice, turning the lover into a mute beast and presenting him to the pharaoh. The story is chilling, yet it captures the emotional complexity of betrayal. Not just anger, but humiliation, heartbreak, the desire for revenge cloaked in elegance. Folk stories, told more informally, were even more colourful. They included tales of clever maidens disguising themselves to test their suitors, of poor boys who won princesses through kindness rather than strength. In one popular fable, a girl tricks 3 would-be grooms into revealing their vanity before choosing the one who offers nothing but a small bird with a broken wing, because, as she says, he knew how to hold something delicate. Children heard these stories early. Parents told them not only to entertain, but to teach. How to listen to their hearts without losing their heads. How to discern true love from fleeting flattery. How to forgive, and when not to. In many of these narratives, animals serve as symbols of desire. Crocodiles for danger. Doves for innocence. Cats, revered and loved, often appear as guardians of the home and affection. A common children's rhyme went, "Where the cat sleeps, love remains." It was believed that cats could sense tension between lovers, and many couples treated them as quiet witnesses to domestic peace or unrest. The gods themselves, as ever, were not far from the stage. Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic, was often evoked in tales of love, lost and found. Her relentless search for Osiris, her reassembling of his broken body, her conception of Horus through love and ritual, made her the ultimate figure of devotion. Her story taught that love could defy death, but also that it demanded sacrifice. Hathor, goddess of joy and sensuality, appears in lighter tales, guiding couples through misunderstandings, blessing those who dare to love across boundaries. One tale tells of a fisherman and a noblewoman who fall in love under her watch. Despite opposition, their love endures, thanks to Hathor's hidden interventions. A well that never runs dry, a songbird that always leads them back to each other. Even Set and Nephthys, gods associated with chaos and mourning, are woven into romantic narratives. Some late stories suggest Nephthys wept for a lost love, her tears falling into the Nile, softening Set's rage. These reinterpretations reflect the Egyptian belief that even in destruction, tenderness might be hidden. The stories weren't just told, they were performed. In festival times, actors and dancers enacted love tales, some comic, some tragic. Audiences watched, laughed, wept, and in those moments, they remembered. Love was a story they all lived. In private, lovers exchanged their own versions, personal myths, whispered promises. When I saw you, one might say, the gods wrote a new tale. And so life and legend intertwined. As we close this chapter, we see that stories in ancient Egypt were not escapism. They were instruction. They reminded people to guard their hearts, to trust wisely, to love fully, but not blindly. They were the night's lullaby and the dawn's warning. In most kingdoms, love bends beneath the weight of power. But in ancient Egypt, the dance between heart and crown was more subtle, more enigmatic, at times honest, at times strategic. Behind the marble faces of statues and the stylized language of court inscriptions lay a truth as old as time. Even those who ruled needed to love, and sometimes that need reshaped empires. Royal marriages in Egypt were rarely simple unions of affection. They were instruments of diplomacy, alliances cast in flesh and linen. A pharaoh's bride might be the daughter of a foreign king. Her journey to Egypt a gesture of peace. Her body became treaty. Her smile became strategy. Yet within these arrangements, real emotions sometimes bloomed, genuine tenderness rising through the cracks of political necessity. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence preserved on clay tablets, reveal the undercurrent of human emotion beneath statecraft. In one, a Babylonian king writes to the Egyptian court, requesting that his daughter, sent to marry the pharaoh, be treated with respect and not left to loneliness. Another pleads, let her not be just a wife in title, but a joy in his eyes. We do not know the women's names. We do not know if their hearts were quieted or inflamed, but we know their fathers worried about their happiness, and that tells us much. Within Egypt's own royal lines, love took many forms. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, perhaps the most visually celebrated royal couple, appear in art not as distant monarchs, but as partners. They are shown playing with their children, touching foreheads, sharing private glances beneath the rays of the Aten sun disk. Whether this affection was artistic propaganda or truth is debated, but the imagery suggests intimacy, a ruler who loved not from duty, but from delight. In their reign, the boundary between political power and spiritual devotion blurred. Akhenaten's religious reforms elevated Nefertiti alongside him as near equal, not only in ceremonial importance, but in divine association. She wasn't just his consort, she was his echo, his mirror, perhaps even his rival in charisma. Then, there is Ramses II, who ruled for over 6 decades and left behind a record of deep affection for his queen, Nefertari. Her tomb, one of the most exquisite ever discovered, is adorned with inscriptions of love and reverence. He calls her the one for whom the sun rises, and in one poetic offering says, "My love for her is eternal, reaching beyond the stars." Nefertari was more than a wife. She was a political partner, a diplomat, a patron of the arts. Their bond, carved in gold and stone, reflects not only romantic passion, but mutual respect. Ramses had many wives, but it is Nefertari who lives most vividly in his monuments. Love at court was not always so exalted. Some royal unions were marked by rivalry, jealousy, even violence. The harem, an institution both luxurious and dangerous, was a space where love and ambition collided. Queens, secondary wives, and concubines all vied for influence, not only over the king's heart, but over succession. Children born of these unions could become pharaohs or pawns. A single night might shift dynastic fate. In one dramatic episode, known from fragmentary papyri, a group of conspirators, led by a lesser queen, plotted to assassinate Ramses III, perhaps in hopes of installing her son as heir. The plot failed, the queen was executed, and her name erased. But beneath the political betrayal, one senses personal desperation. Perhaps she had once been chosen with a smile, promised something lasting, only to be sidelined. And in her fury, she reached for power in the only way left. Love, in such settings, could never be simple. Pharaohs were gods on earth, yet they longed as humans do. Some disguised their affection, protecting it from court intrigue. Others indulged it openly. Records suggest that certain kings built private villas for favored lovers, filling them with musicians, fountains, and moonlit gardens. These retreats offered escape from ceremony, allowing the heart to speak without witness. But even the highest born were vulnerable to heartbreak. Tales abound of kings who mourned deeply, who built tombs too soon, who sang to the dead in secret. One inscription in a Theban tomb reads, "He built this place not for glory, but to lie near her." Another, found in the ruins of a sun temple, simply says, "I asked the gods for gold, they gave me her. Then they took her back." Even royal daughters and sons were not spared the weight of political love. Some were married off as children, shipped to distant lands. Others were never allowed to marry, kept in sacred celibacy, to serve temple roles. One princess, Ankhsenamun, may have been forced to marry more than once for stability, and in a desperate letter to a foreign ruler, pleaded to be given a husband of her own choosing. Her letter ends abruptly. We do not know if she found freedom or silence. Amid all this, love sometimes crossed class. There are scattered references to pharaohs who fell for dancers, musicians, servants. These relationships, though rarely recorded officially, left traces. An unnamed woman buried with royal ornaments. A poem found near a temple describing a girl whose voice stilled the war in my bones. Whether these were moments of genuine connection or fleeting indulgence, we may never know. But they remind us that even in halls of power, affection was possible. In the end, love in the shadow of crowns was both a gift and a curse. It could elevate a person to divine memory, or erase them entirely. It could shape empires or shatter dynasties. But always, it left marks, on stone, on parchment, in the spaces where history dared not speak too loudly. In the world of ancient Egypt, where the spoken word held divine power and silence often bore meaning, the senses became a secret language of their own. Love, in this land of gods and gold, was not confined to declarations or rituals. It moved, in subtler ways, through the brush of fingertips, the scent of skin, the music of laughter echoing through a narrow street. Touch was perhaps the most sacred of all. It was not casual. To touch someone, on the shoulder, the cheek, the wrist, was to enter their orbit. Lovers did not necessarily embrace in public, but in private, the skin spoke without need for speech. A stroke of the back as one passed by, a finger tracing, a line down the forearm, the pressing of foreheads in stillness. These gestures, preserved in tomb paintings and hinted at in poetry, were acts of devotion. One poem describes a woman whose fingers bloom like petals against my chest. Another, written by a man, says, "She pressed her palm to mine, and I forgot my name." These are not metaphors of conquest. They are invitations to be known. Scent, too, was powerful. Perfumes in ancient Egypt were not mere luxury. They were expressions of identity, emotion, even intent. Lovers would scent themselves with carefully blended oils. Myrrh, frankincense, blue lotus, cinnamon, and sweet resins. Each had its meaning. The blue lotus, often associated with rebirth and ecstasy, was used in romantic settings to heighten connection. Its scent, earthy, sweet, slightly narcotic, was thought to open the heart and soften the soul. Women wore cones of perfumed fat atop their heads during special occasions. These cones melted slowly in the heat, releasing fragrance as the evening progressed. A lover might lean close and whisper a line of verse, inhaling the rising sweetness. It was not just seduction, it was presence. In private, couples often shared scented oils. Some archaeologists have found alabaster jars buried with inscriptions like "for love," "for memory," or simply the name of a beloved. These jars were small, easily held in the hand, passed from one body to another. Their contents were sacred, liquid prayers of longing. Sound, too, played its role. The music of love in Egypt came from harps, flutes, lutes, and voices. In both temples and homes, songs were part of courtship and connection. Love poems were sung aloud, sometimes softly in the ear, sometimes in the open during festivals. The lyrics were rarely boastful. They spoke of desire with vulnerability, of beauty with wonder. One common theme was the sound of a lover's voice. "Her laugh is like water from a deep well," one man wrote. Another said, "When he speaks, the birds pause to listen." These phrases were not flowery excess. They were attempts to capture the uncatchable, the moment the heart responds before the mind. Some couples created private sounds, shared rhythms, phrases, humming. One story tells of a woman who always tapped 3 times before entering a room, so her lover would know it was her. Another story mentions a man who carved tiny flutes, each tuned to a note she liked best. These were gestures of intimacy, of listening. The gaze, too, held its own language. Egyptian art, while stylized, often captures eyes turned toward one another. Not just faces positioned for symmetry, but eyes locked, seeing, noticing. In love poems, The lover's eyes are described as pools, as birds, as night itself. She looked once, says one verse, and I burned for days. Another speaks of a single glance passed during a market day that unwound the threads of my robe without touching. Staring was not considered rude. It was a declaration, a quiet assertion that something had been felt. In many tomb scenes, lovers are shown looking not at offerings or gods, but at each other. This visual choice was deliberate. It said, in effect, this is what mattered most. Even in the afterlife, they wanted to keep seeing one another. Taste, though rarely written of directly, played its part. Couples often shared meals, and certain foods were tied to passion. Figs, dates, honey, and wine were all associated with pleasure. Sharing a sweet fruit, sipping from the same cup. These were more than hospitality. They were communion. A moment to taste what the other tasted, to live for a second in the same sensory space. There's evidence that some lovers created special meals, incorporating ingredients believed to enhance love or fertility. Garlic for heat, pomegranate for persistence, coriander to clear the heart, as one old recipe says. These meals weren't grand banquets, but small sacred rituals, each bite an offering. Even temperature was considered. Sleeping arrangements in wealthier homes often included cooled stone headrests or warmed mats. A caring partner might prepare these in advance, creating comfort not through riches, but through forethought. To anticipate the body's needs was a form of sensual attentiveness. Silence, finally, was the most overlooked of the senses. The Egyptians valued stillness, in love as in worship. Silence could speak louder than anything else. Sitting side by side beneath the stars, saying nothing. Listening to the river without comment. Holding hands without moving. These were not empty spaces. They were full. One inscription, carved onto a wooden chair given as a gift, reads, "You sat beside me and the room became wider." Another, on the base of a water jar, says, "Her quiet was my comfort." In the end, love in ancient Egypt was not just felt in the heart, it was lived in the body. The senses were not distractions from the sacred, they were doorways into it. To touch, to hear, to smell, to taste, to see, and to pause, this was worship in motion. In the land of eternal sun and sand, the Egyptians understood the body not as a machine to be repaired, but as a sacred vessel, a bridge between heaven and earth. And just as the stars were read for omens and the Nile for rhythms, so too was the body read for its stories, of pleasure, of pain, of longing. In this holistic view of health, love and sexuality were not just physical matters. They were matters of life force, of harmony, of Ma'at itself. The medical texts of ancient Egypt reflect a world where affection and anatomy met in careful detail. Scrolls like the Ebers, papyrus and the Kahun, gynecological papyrus, speak of ailments of the heart and loins with both clinical precision and spiritual reverence. The ancients did not separate body and soul. When a person ached from longing, it was understood as both emotional and physical. When desire dulled, it was treated as an imbalance that needed realignment. Sexual health was no taboo in this society. Instead, it was addressed directly, often with remarkable openness. There were remedies for impotence, for low libido, for excessive desire, for infertility. Some involved herbs, wild lettuce, onion, garlic, date pollen, honey. Others involved rituals, prayers to Bes or Hathor, incense burned under a bed, amulets placed beneath pillows. A man struggling with virility might be given a mixture of crushed carob, dates, and beer to be drunk under the waxing moon. A woman seeking fertility might wear a girdle soaked in frankincense oil, or sleep with a fertility figurine beneath her mattress, crafted in the shape of a frog or a full womb. These treatments weren't considered magical in opposition to medicine. They were medicine through the lens of spirit. Midwives held vast knowledge passed down through generations. They could read pulses, examine discharges, detect pregnancies, and advise on the right time to conceive. Some were literate, others simply learned by touch, by intuition. They used their hands like instruments, their words like salve, and always love hovered near. Emotional wounds were often treated with as much care as physical ones. One scroll includes a set of verses meant to be recited over a patient with a heavy heart, believed to be suffering from unspoken grief or unfulfilled desire. The remedy: a bath of rosewater and myrrh, a song sung at dusk, and a message sent, perhaps a letter, perhaps a token, to the one whose absence caused the ailment. Sexual exhaustion was recognized too. It was not mocked but acknowledged. A.e. man weakened by nightly devotion might be prescribed rest, wine, and solitude. A woman burning with unseen fire might be advised to walk in gardens, to wear linen cooled with lotus oil, to pray to Hathor for balance. Pleasure was not a sin, but its excess or absence could disrupt the self. Diseases of the reproductive system were treated with seriousness and specificity. Vaginal infections, for instance, were addressed with suppositories made from honey and acacia, a mixture with both antibacterial and symbolic properties. Men suffering from swelling or sores were given ointments made from fenugreek and juniper and told to recite calming verses while applying them. But the Egyptians also knew the power of suggestion. Some of their treatments read more like rituals of reassurance than pharmacology. A woman who feared barrenness might be told to sleep facing the north wind, thought to carry fertility. A man anxious about his potency might be given a carved lion tooth to wear around his neck, with the words, "Strength lies in you, as in the desert hunter." The emotional context of physical intimacy was honored. It was understood that love, if broken or withheld, could make the body sick. One preserved case study, part medical text, part parable, describes a woman who stopped speaking, eating, or sleeping after her husband took a second wife. The treatment? Not a drug, but reconciliation. The healer arranged for the husband to visit her alone, to bathe her feet, to speak words of comfort. Within 3 days, the woman was healed. This approach, treating illness as something to be softened, understood, realigned, runs through Egyptian healing philosophy. There was little sense of punishment or moral failure in bodily issues related to love. There was, instead, the recognition that life was complex, the heart unpredictable, and the soul in constant motion. Men and women both sought remedies for heartbreak. Some used herbal teas to dull emotion, infusions of poppy, chamomile, or lotus. Others made small offerings at household shrines, asking the gods to ease the tightening in the chest, or remove the echo of his name from my dreams. Grief was not hurried. It was allowed to move through the body at its own pace. Love spells and healing often overlapped. A charm used to attract affection might also relieve insomnia. A potion for fertility might restore a sense of beauty and self-worth. The aim was always restoration, not just of desire, but of wholeness. In one poignant record, a woman writes her own prescription. "I shall wear the dress he loved. I shall sit in the sun and eat sweet things. I shall not forget him, but I shall remember myself." That too was healing. There is evidence that some temples, especially those dedicated to Isis, functioned as centers of emotional recovery. Women went there after loss, after betrayal, after childbirth. They prayed, bathed, offered mirrors and combs as symbols of renewal. They were reminded that to be alive, to feel, to want, was not shameful. It was sacred. Even in death, healing rituals touched the heart. Widows and widowers were known to write final letters, placing them beneath the wrappings of the deceased. Some included small vials of perfume, tokens of shared touch. These were not just mementos, they were medicine for the soul left behind. And so, in the medical traditions of ancient Egypt, we find a remarkable tenderness. The body was not isolated from feeling. It was its vessel, a vessel to be nourished, soothed, listened to. When words fade, symbols remain. And in ancient Egypt, Where language was both art and magic, symbols were more than decoration. They were memory. They held the weight of prayers, the secrets of affection, the outlines of longing etched into eternity. In this visual culture, where image and meaning were inseparable, love lived not only in hearts, but in stone, wood, gold, and pigment. Every detail had a voice. A lotus blooming in a lover's hand spoke of renewal and desire. A bird flying beside a couple signified the soul's freedom to love. A mirror carved onto a tomb wall wasn't vanity. It was an invitation to reflect on beauty, to remember how it felt to be seen, adored. The Egyptians had no single word for art as we understand it. Their works were not separate from life. A painted wall, a sculpted figurine, a necklace inlaid with turquoise and coral. These were expressions of the divine order and personal devotion. And love, as one of the most divine forces, was a recurring theme. In tombs, scenes of romantic and familial intimacy were carved with reverent care. Couples are shown offering food to each other, embracing, holding hands as they walk into the afterlife together. Children stand between them or wrap their arms around a parent's leg. These are not stiff royal portraits. They are frozen moments of tenderness. In one tomb, a husband is depicted passing a fruit to his wife. Her smile is subtle, her hand outstretched, not in demand, but in shared pleasure. In another, a wife fans her husband as he reclines. The gesture is not servitude, it is mutual comfort. Such scenes were chosen carefully, intended not only for remembrance, but as blueprints for eternity. Jewelry also carried layered meaning. A necklace of alternating red and green beads might represent the cycle of passion and renewal. Heart-shaped pendants, often crafted from carnelian or lapis, were worn as tokens of fidelity. Some rings bore the names of both lovers, fused together in hieroglyphic script like a whispered vow cast into metal. Amulets were abundant. The Djed pillar symbolized stability, an anchoring presence in love. The Ankh, the cross-shaped sign of life, was often exchanged between partners as a blessing. May our love be life itself. The knot of Isis, a stylized loop of cloth, represented fertility and feminine power. When carved into a bedpost or hidden beneath a mattress, it served as both a prayer and a protection. Even furniture became testimony. Beds were inscribed with verses of love, or with tiny animals. Frogs for fertility, cats for passion, geese for loyalty. Headrests carved with twin figures reminded sleepers that they were not alone. Chairs bore the names of couples, scratched by their own hands or those of artisans hired for the task. One wooden stool, now in a museum, carries a single phrase: "He waited here for her." The architecture of homes also reflected the rhythms of intimacy. Rooms were often arranged around central courtyards where families gathered, but private spaces, cool, shadowed, soft with woven linens, were set aside for intimacy. Some homes had niches for small statues of deities associated with love and protection, like Bez and Hathor, where couples made offerings before union. Gardens were deeply symbolic, both in myth and in physical form. A couple's shared tree, a pond reflecting moonlight, a bench shaded by vines. These were not just spaces for rest, but for connection. A lover might plant a fig tree as a gift. Another might craft a pathway of smooth stones, each representing a step in their relationship. Inside these gardens, symbols came alive. Birds were released on festival days, carrying wishes skyward. Perfumed flowers were braided into garlands and laid across beds. The act of tending a garden became metaphoric. Love required care, trimming, attention to bloom. The visual language extended even to cosmetics. Kohl applied around the eyes was not just for beauty or protection against glare. It symbolized clarity of vision, to see one's lover clearly, both physically and spiritually. Henna on fingertips or toes marked celebration, often applied before weddings or reunions. It was joy made visible. Musical instruments also carried symbolic weight. A lute given as a gift was more than an object. It was an offering of sound, of shared moments. Harps often depicted lovers or stories of devotion etched onto their frames. One surviving instrument bears the inscription, "Play me as your fingers played my heart." And then there were the statues. In some tombs, full-bodied sculptures of couples were placed facing each other, their hands eternally linked. These statues were not mere likenesses. They were vessels for the ka, the soul. By placing the lovers together in stone, the Egyptians believed they ensured their reunion beyond death. One pair sits so close that their hips touch, their gazes forever. Meeting in the hush of time, even absence was symbolized. A lone figure carved beside an empty chair. A pair of sandals, one slightly smaller, arranged as if waiting for their match. These quiet symbols of longing resonate more than any inscription. They whisper of someone missed, someone cherished, someone whose presence still lingers in form. Painted papyri tell stories too. Illustrated scrolls show lovers walking through fields of reeds, greeted by deities, welcomed into paradise not alone, but as a pair. These visions were promises that what was felt in life could be carried forward. What's most extraordinary is not the craftsmanship, but the emotion embedded within it. Egyptian art did not seek to abstract or idealize love. It sought to preserve it, to keep its colors fresh even when flesh had faded. To the Egyptians, love was as natural as the flooding of the Nile, cyclical, vital, sacred. But to outsiders, foreigners who stepped onto their shores, or later civilizations who uncovered their tombs, Egyptian love often seemed like something stranger, richer, even magical. Through the eyes of Greeks, Romans, and beyond, the private world of Egyptian intimacy was refracted, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes romanticized, but always watched with fascination. The Greeks were among the first to leave written impressions of Egyptian life from the outside in. Herodotus, often called the father of history, traveled through Egypt in the 5th century BCE and reported with awe on their customs, particularly those involving the body. He noted how Egyptian men shaved their entire bodies for cleanliness, how women wore perfume and makeup, not just for beauty, but ritual. To Greek eyes, this was exotic, evidence of a people who lived closely with the sensual and the sacred. But Herodotus also saw contradiction. He described Egyptians as more modest than his own people in public. Yet he heard tales of fertility festivals where men and women danced wildly, sometimes unclothed, in honor of the gods. The sexual duality of restraint and release struck him. He interpreted it not as contradiction, but as mystery, a culture that held passion in reverence, not shame. Later, Greek writers added layers to the legend. They described temple rituals involving sacred prostitutes, though modern historians debate whether these practices truly existed or were imaginative projections. To Greeks and then Romans, the idea that a woman might sleep with a man as a religious act, channeling Hathor or Isis, was both scandalous and fascinating. These tales, often unverified, fueled centuries of myth-making about Egypt as a land of erotic excess. The image of Cleopatra, the last great queen of Egypt, became the apex of that mythology. To Egyptians, Cleopatra VII was an educated, multilingual ruler, a strategist who wrote treatises on medicine, philosophy, and linguistics. But to Roman writers like Plutarch and later poets, she was transformed into something else, a siren of the East, a seductress who bewitched Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her beauty, her voice, her exotic rituals. In truth, Cleopatra was playing politics. She understood Roman power and used her femininity as diplomacy. She hosted banquets steeped in Egyptian symbolism, wore perfumes meant to evoke goddess-like presence, and used art and theatre to reinforce her image as both divine and desirable. Her love affairs were not scandal, they were strategy. But over time, the nuance was lost, replaced by a legend of intoxicating love that led to empire's collapse. This fascination with Egypt's sensual mystique extended into Roman culture. The Romans adopted and adapted many Egyptian deities, particularly Isis. Isis temples spread across the Mediterranean, and with them came rites that emphasized rebirth, motherhood, and devotion. Roman women wore amulets in her honor, often invoking her blessing over childbirth and marriage. In private, Roman aristocrats mimicked Egyptian practices. Scented oils, elaborate bath rituals, and lotus-decorated bedrooms, transforming Egyptian sensuality into Roman luxury. Centuries later, when Napoleon's armies marched into Egypt in the 18th century, they brought with them artists and scholars. The French, like the Romans before them, fell in love with Egypt, not only its monuments, but its myths. Paintings from the Orientalist movement began to depict imagined scenes of Egyptian harems, of sultry priestesses, of desert queens reclining in moonlight. These were fantasies, not historical truths. Yet they captured a European hunger to believe in a land where love was not restrained, but celebrated. Victorian explorers were more cautious. They marveled at the temples, but blushed at the erotic. Papyri. Some artifacts, like the Turin erotic papyrus, were hidden in private collections or kept in museum back rooms, shown only to scholars. The same society that built empires was unsure how to talk about what it found carved on ancient walls. Lovers entwined without shame, poems that praised the sweetness of thighs and lips. And yet, the appeal endured. Poets and writers from Shelley to Oscar Wilde referenced Egyptian love. Some romanticized the afterlife reunions described in tombs. Others found metaphor in the way Egyptian art captured closeness without overt sexuality. The very restraint of the images, they argued, hinted at a deeper, more enduring passion. Modern pop culture would pick up the thread again. Films, novels, and television series have all played with Egyptian romantic imagery. Cleopatra is still reimagined again and again, sometimes as a feminist icon, sometimes as a femme fatale. Temples become stages for seduction. Mummies rise from their tombs, not for vengeance, but for the kiss they were denied. The Nile becomes a river of memory, of dreams, of long-lost caresses. But what do these projections say? They tell us that Egyptian love still haunts the imagination. Not because it was more exotic or more erotic, but because it was whole. It made room for body and spirit, pleasure and devotion, moment and eternity. In a world that often separates these things, Egypt integrated them, and outsiders, perhaps sensing something missing in their own views of love, look to the Nile with longing. In academic circles today, scholars work to strip away the fantasy and return to the human. They read love letters written on shards of pottery, analyze worn amulets, study temple layouts not for spectacle but for intimacy. And in doing so, they find what has always been there, people in love. Egyptian lovers were not myths. They were real. They worried. They whispered. They reached for each other across class, across time, across the boundaries of flesh and spirit. And while the world watched from outside, sometimes misunderstanding, sometimes marveling, the lovers lived, quietly and boldly in their own language. Time has no mercy. It buries, it breaks, it forgets. And yet, somehow, fragments remain. An amulet tucked beneath a linen shroud, a line of poetry on a broken potsherd, a kiss etched in stone. These remnants of love from ancient Egypt speak, not only of a distant world, but of enduring truths. They call across 4,000 years to remind us what it means to be human. The first lesson is this: love was not hidden, it was honored. In many cultures, particularly those shaped by later moral codes, love, especially physical love, became something to conceal or discipline. But in Egypt, the body was never shameful. It was a sacred instrument through which joy, affection, and reverence could be expressed. The skin, the voice, the eyes, all were tools of devotion. Egyptians wrote of desire without apology. They described longing with metaphor and melody. They understood that the way a lover smiled could realign the heart, that the scent of someone's hair could linger longer than memory. They showed us that intimacy, when paired with honesty, is a form of grace. The second lesson is that love was not perfect, but real. The scrolls and stelae do not paint a world of endless harmony. They show jealousy, betrayal, loneliness. They show one-sided affections, marriages of duty, losses that never quite healed. But through it all runs a thread of hope, the belief that love, despite its thorns, is worth pursuing. Even when hearts were broken, the Egyptians did not turn bitter. They prayed for healing. They wrote letters to the dead, not in anger, but in yearning. They sought meaning not only in joy, but in sorrow. A love lost was still a love lived. This recognition that love's worth is not measured by duration or outcome, but by depth, is something modern hearts often forget. In a world of instant messages and vanishing attention, ancient Egypt reminds us to linger, to feel, to remember. The third lesson lies in balance. The Egyptians built their world on Marat, order, harmony, rightness. In love, this principle applied too. Passion was vital, but not if it burned too hot. Possession was dangerous. Love required rhythm, patience, care. To force was to violate. To share was to bless. A good partner was one who listened, who touched gently, who left room for the other's spirit. This philosophy extended beyond romance. It shaped friendships, parenthood, community. Love was never a one-person stage. It was a duet, a chorus, a garden. The fourth lesson is about legacy. In so many tombs, love was carved as deliberately as lineage. A man might forget to mention his titles, but not the name of the woman who waited for him each evening. A queen might be depicted not in regal pose, but holding hands with her consort beneath a fig tree. These choices tell us what mattered most. Not conquests, not wealth, but connection. When facing eternity, the Egyptians did not ask to be remembered as powerful. They asked to be remembered as loving. In this, there is a soft rebellion against the noise of achievement, against the obsession with control. The Egyptians knew what endures, not the gold, not the crown, but the feeling of another's fingers, entwined in yours, the sound of shared laughter under stars. The fifth lesson is that love is layered. The Egyptians did not divide the sensual from the spiritual. A kiss could be worship. A poem could be prayer. A night together could echo through the heavens. This integration of heart and soul, body and cosmos, made their love both intimate and infinite. They showed us that to love fully is to love with all parts of the self. To listen not only to the voice, but to the silence. To see not only the face, but the unseen story behind it. To touch not only skin, but memory. Modern life often splits love into categories: emotional, physical, platonic, spiritual. But the Egyptians lived without these walls. A friend could be cherished like a brother. A wife could be revered like a goddess. A child's hug could echo like music. They did not rank types of love. They honored all of it. The sixth lesson, perhaps the most haunting, is that love survives. So much was lost. Cities swallowed by sand, scrolls eaten by fire, names worn away by time. And yet, these fragments remain. Why? Because people chose to speak of love, to write it, sculpt it, bury it beside them. They believed that to name a thing is to give it power, that to remember love is to keep it alive. And maybe, in the end, that's the greatest gift Egypt has given us. A reminder that even when the world turns to dust, love leaves a shape behind. Today, we walk through museums and gaze at these shapes. We read the translations. We hold replicas in our hands. And whether we realize it or not, we participate in their spell. We remember, we feel, we recognize. Because though the rituals have changed, the heart has not. A young woman reading a love spell in a candlelit room, a man writing to his absent partner by the riverside, a couple planting a tree together in spring. These are not just historical images, they are echoes of us. What endures? In a world of shifting screens and fleeting attention, what remains when the message is deleted, the voice note unheard, the promise broken before morning? Perhaps this is why we keep turning back to the banks of the Nile, to the painted tombs and crumbling temples, to those silent lovers carved in stone. Not for nostalgia, not for myth, but because in their simplicity, their sincerity, their sacred stillness, we recognize something missing from our modern noise. The Egyptians lived slowly. Their days were tied to the sun, to the river, to the seasons. They observed the smallest signs, a flower blooming a day early, the wind shifting toward the east, the way a lover blinked before speaking. They believed these moments mattered, that the universe whispered through them, that love wasn't something to chase, but to tend. What does that mean for us? We who scroll past faces in an instant, we who speak in abbreviations, we who guard our hearts behind irony, who flinch from vulnerability like it might bite. What do these ancient lovers offer us beyond curiosity? They offer us patience. A letter etched on pottery cannot be unsent. A carved name on a bedpost does not fade with mood. When the Egyptians wrote of love, they wrote as if it mattered forever, and not because it always lasted, but because, while it did, it shaped them. They didn't record only the success stories. They recorded the ache, the waiting, the silence. That honesty is rare today. We are trained to present perfection. Curated, smiles, perfect lighting, endless confidence. But the Egyptians knew love wasn't clean. It was messy, awkward, unsure. They left space for that. A woman could write, "I miss you," without fear. A man could say, "I weep for your absence," without shame. They trusted emotion as truth. That's a kind of courage we need now. Not loud declarations, but quiet sincerity. The ability to feel without flinching, to desire without apology, to remember without bitterness. Egypt also teaches us about ritual, not just ceremony, but the ritual of intention, preparing a space, lighting a lamp, touching a talisman, speaking a name aloud. Today, we rush through affection, texts without punctuation, phone calls during commutes, half-held hands. But what if we slowed down? What if we wrote one sentence to someone we love by hand? What if we left it in their coat pocket, not to impress, but to express? What if we made tea for someone without asking, or played a song that reminded us of them, not with explanation, just with presence? The Egyptians didn't need grand gestures. They believed that love lived in small, repeated acts. The shared piece of fruit, the smell of oil in the hair, the whispered prayer before bed. These weren't performances, they were lifelines. And perhaps most of all, they offer us a view of love that is both intimate and infinite. We often split these two. Love is either small and fleeting, a crush, a night, a phase, or so big it's abstract. Soulmate, forever, one true love. But the Egyptians lived in the space between. They loved fully, but without needing to possess. They mourned deeply, but with the hope of reunion. They saw the divine in the daily. What if we did too? What if we saw the making of a bed as an act of care, the listening to someone's dream as an offering, the brushing of hair as a blessing? What if we allowed the sacred back into our most human moments? The Egyptians did not love perfectly. They had jealousy, betrayal, fear, but they also had a framework. Love was not just a feeling, it was a practice, a way of being in the world. It had rules, rhythms, and rewards. It shaped who you were. They remind us that to love is to choose, to turn toward, again and again, not just when it's easy, to remember what matters when everything else fades. They remind us that love has weight, not the weight of pressure, but of presence. The kind of weight that anchors you, that holds you steady when the flood comes. As we walk through our own world, full of distractions, demands, and disconnect, what might it look like to love with Egyptian patience? To flirt with poetry instead of performance? To grieve without rushing? To believe, even in doubt, that the heart remembers what the mind forgets? It might look like silence held together, like letters not sent, but saved, like a single flower laid on a doorstep with no name attached. It might look like listening longer, touching slower, asking once more instead of assuming. It might look like speaking less and meaning more. It might look like two hands carved into stone that no earthquake has broken. As we prepare to close this journey, one chapter remains, a quiet farewell, not just to this story, but to the lives we've glimpsed, the scribe who waited, the girl who sang, the lovers who wrote their names into time. In that farewell, we will not say goodbye. We will say something softer, something the Egyptians would have understood. We will say, "Remember me." Somewhere along the Nile, under a stretch of silent sky, two names are carved into stone, side by side, barely visible. The wind has worn the edges. The sun has faded the groove. But if you trace your fingers gently across the surface, you can still feel the indentations. Still hear, if you listen closely, what they once whispered to one another. Remember me. That is the oldest prayer. Older than empires, older than gods, not for glory, not for praise, just memory, just a place in someone's heart, however small, to be carried forward, not as a legend, but as a presence. We've walked together through 20 chapters of lives long gone, scribes and servants, queens and priestesses, jealous rivals, hopeful dreamers, quiet companions. We've stepped into shadowed bedrooms and crowded markets, followed love spells and funeral laments, traced poems scratched into pottery and names wrapped in linen. And through it all, a single thread has remained. The deep, tender, irrepressible desire to be seen, known, cherished. The Egyptians never asked for immortality in the way we often imagine it. They did not long to be worshipped. They longed to be remembered in love. That's why they carved not only the names of kings, but of lovers, children, friends. That's why they wrote poems not about conquest, but about the way someone's voice could soften a day. That's why they wrapped the dead with perfume and verses, so even in death, the story would not end. They believed in reunion, not only with the gods, but with each other. In the field of reeds, the afterlife they imagined, you walked barefoot through soft grass, beside the one you loved. You sat under a fruiting tree. You held hands. You were not alone. It was not a paradise of pleasures or punishments. It was a place where love endured, quietly, faithfully, beautifully. In a modern world that rushes toward endings, next text, next swipe, next distraction, the Egyptian vision reminds us that endings can be soft, that the final word need not be a goodbye. That remembrance is a form of keeping. We carry this, even now, in the way we save old letters, in the way we whisper names in sleep, in the way we smell something sweet and are instantly transported to a moment we thought was lost. These are modern, echoes of ancient rituals. You do not need to build a tomb to remember someone. You only need to light a candle, to speak their name, to pause when the wind changes and say, "I remember." You only need to make space in your day for memory, not of perfection, but of presence. The way someone laughed, the way they rested their hand, the way they made you feel, even for a second. Because memory, when woven with love, becomes prayer, and love, when given room to breathe, becomes sacred. So what do we do now? With all that we've seen, all that we've felt, we return to our own lives, but not unchanged. We return slower, softer, more attentive. We begin to notice the rituals we already live, the way we make tea for someone without asking, the way we text "home yet?" not for information, but for care. We begin to see that love is not a performance. It is a pattern, a rhythm, a way of moving through the world that leaves others warmer in our wake. Perhaps we will write more, not long declarations, just small notes, thinking of you. Saw this and smiled. Still here. These are our modern love spells. Perhaps we will listen more. Sit longer. Resist the urge to fill every silence. Let the moment bloom, like lotus from mud, into something that doesn't need explaining. Perhaps we will touch more deliberately. A hug held a little tighter. A hand on the shoulder with intention. The brushing of someone's hair back into place. These are our private hieroglyphs. And perhaps, most importantly, we will remember not only those we have lost, but those we still have, and those we have yet to meet. We will remember that everyone longs to be known, that behind every guarded glance is a heart asking, "Do you see me?" To answer yes, to look, to stay, to choose love again and again, is to live like the Egyptians did, with open eyes, with full hands, with reverent hearts. And if one day, long after we are gone, someone finds a note we left, a photo, a song that once meant something to us, maybe they too will pause. Maybe they will smile. Maybe they will whisper, not knowing why. They loved. And that will be enough. That will be everything. So now, as we step away from the Nile and into the present, we carry with us the dust of tombs and the breath of poems. We carry not just stories, but ways of seeing. We carry the scribe's ink, the dancer's feet, the widow's song, the child's laughter echoing through a courtyard. And in the quiet moments, those sacred, ordinary, fleeting seconds, we will know love is still alive, not only in history, not only in legend, but here, now, with us, etched into us, forever.